hello. So excited to see you all. Tonight we have a special event for you. This is, first of all, I would like to introduce myself for those who don't know me. My name is Avital. I live in the Western Galilee and I work in the Jewish Agency in the program called Partnership Together, which connects between the Western Galilee and 16 Jewish communities in the US and the Jewish community of Budapest. And we do many, many programs. And this is quite a new program, which is called the P2G, the Partnership Together Film Club. And I want to introduce you to the facilitator of the P2G Film Club, Alon Meron. He's a film teacher and a director, and we're very lucky to have him with us. So Alon, take the stage.
And the former P2G lecturer.
Oh, yes.
This being the second meeting, the second movie that we've watched together, to me it's wonderful to see all this amount of people kind of growing from each meeting. For me, it's very exciting, and I mean, I think the standard, the quality that we're setting is great. And I'm very, very happy to have Amichai here, Amichai Greenberg, the director of the movie Aedut.
The Testament.
The Testament, yeah. A wonderful and interesting movie that, since I saw it, my mind is still thinking about it, and I'm always realizing new things about it. I'm guessing you guys are too. Without further ado, Amichai, feel free to take it away.
Thank you so much for this generous introduction. So I'm Amichai, and I created this film. It took me around 10 years to create this film, even a bit more. And as I said in many occasions, it was like, I think the movie created me, not less than I created it, meaning it influenced me greatly, the process of making it and even distributing it and showing it all over the world. I'll say a few words about this film. Well, we came out at 2017 in Venice, and since then it really took off all over the world. We were in many, many festivals. It was even distributed in China and in North America, and a lot of Jewish film festivals. And in France, we were distributed in cinemas, like in 70 cinemas around France, and really got a really nice audience. But I'll just, in order for you to understand where I come from, I'll just give you a brief story. So when we just came out with the film, even before finishing the complete editing, we wanted to do a testing, like a screening, where we test how the movie works. So we usually did it with 10, 15 people, but when we tried to do it with a larger audience, and then we did it on Yom HaShoah here in Israel with Amcha, which is an organization here in Israel that supports Holocaust survivors. And basically, I invited my parents to come. My father is a survivor, and both my grandparents. And he was in the audience. We screened the film, and after it was finished, the moderator there asked, "Okay, what's your connection to the Shoah?" So I said, "Well, my father, and he's here in the room." And she asked, "Okay, would you like to say something?" And my father didn't want to say a thing. And I waited a day, 2, 3, and I heard nothing. So I called him and asked him, "What did you think about this film?" So he said, "Really, I would like to tell you that I feel that it's a very Jewish film, a very truthful film, genuine. But honestly, who would like to see such a film? Who would be interested?" And the first second, I lost all the air I had in my lungs, and I just felt like someone beat me up in my stomach and I'm suffocating. But 1 second later, I understood exactly why I did this film. I wanted to share and speak about realities that otherwise I didn't have how to. And I was raised in a family where I think there's a huge lack of trust in the world, which I could understand because my father as a kid was in the Krakow ghetto, and exactly like in Schindler's List, when you see how they evacuate the ghetto, he was there, but wasn't caught. He was hiding, but he saw. And I think that influenced him greatly. And therefore, this is my life journey, this film. I mean, my first feature, and I feel that it was it's as if to penetrate those transparent walls that I had. But after saying all of this, I'll contradict myself and I'll say that for me, it's not a Shoah film. It's not a Holocaust film. For me, it's a film about identity. And this is really what I wanted to touch with this film. It's just that me personally, my own story is hooked up, is connected to the Shoah. And I feel that it has a great impact and influence on my identity. And therefore, I explored my identity through the Holocaust. I think Primo Levi said that like the Holocaust is like an earthquake, that through the cracks in the ground, you're able to see what lies beneath. And I think in that exploration of what does it mean to be human? And what defines you and what is identity? And I feel it's a crucial question that I was faced with. I still am, and I think that the world is facing this question at many levels, where you see the challenges between right and left. It's in the US or Europe, and I feel that touches questions of identity. Do we define ourselves? How do we define ourselves? And do we define ourselves in the easiest way? And that's what we're not, meaning by hating someone else, we define who we are, and that's the easiest way. But the deeper call is, and the more complicated one, is to dig deep in. And that's a life journey, to explore yourself and to understand what you're built of and what you stand for. And this is really what I wanted to touch with this film. So at this point, I think I'll give you an opportunity to ask me questions. And if you won't have any, I'll just go on, but go ahead.
You can unmute if you want to ask question or write in the chat.
I have a couple of questions. Can you hear me?
Yes, sure.
Okay, so actually, let me go to I have a list of questions. First of all, Yoel's mother, why do you think she would have willingly given away her secret? I mean, she kept it such a dark secret from everyone after the war. Why would in her testimony, would she have talked about that?
Yeah. So there is such a thing as confidential testimonials. I worked for the Spielberg project, but I worked also a bit for Yad Vashem, even though there's not so many as I show in the film, but there are people who want to take a burden off their chest, meaning they have a secret, but they don't want to, so they could determine that nobody will be able to approach it until they die, or I don't know, a certain amount of years. But they do want to let go of it. They want to say it, to take that burden off, because it's a very, very big thing that influences your life to keep that kind of secret. So this is how I understood her psychology. That she wants. I myself gathered testimonies in Israel, like a few hundreds of them through the Spielberg project, and what I saw that when we ended, usually they could invite their families. Sometimes the families were extremely aware of their story, but so many times you could see that I, as the guy who collected the testimony, knew about them much more than their own families. So people, after going through horror, don't want to share certain aspects with their families, either because they don't want to make. There's this thing that they don't want to. They had enough of a bad experience. They don't want to share it, that it would influence them. They want to protect them from it, or because they had secrets. They could have families that they left behind, people that they don't know what happened with them, or terrible stuff that they don't want to share.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, and I have other questions, but I'm going to leave it to other people to ask if they have. So the other question I had, at the end of the film, when Yoel goes to his mother's funeral and he participates in the funeral, it's a Jewish funeral, even though he knows that she's not necessarily Jewish. Was that indicative of the fact that he came to terms with living with this lie, or was he still conflicted, in a way that he couldn't identify as being Jewish anymore?
I think there's here a strong paradox, because he's so Jewish in the ways. That was the most interesting thing for me, because it's as if he has this thing of a way about life. And this way is so Jewish in many ways, but yet through this way, he needs to be so truthful that he needs to admit that he's not Jewish. And this is some kind of a paradox that I wanted to touch, and basically to leave it as an open question, because I think, at least for me, I'm somewhere in between those lines, which is, in many ways, she's very Jewish. In many ways, she's Ruta Moabiyah, exactly like where we learn the thing of Giyur in Judaism, because she took upon herself the destiny of the Jewish people in the biggest way you can imagine, like Ruth did back in the days with Naomi. And yet, halachically, like through the rules, she's not considered. So, is she or isn't she? And what does that mean? So, I think I'm keeping this question for you, the audience, to think of.
I think it reflects on him. He had a very rigid character. He identified himself. Of course, he was brought up as Orthodox Jew, but the fact that his mother, by chance, she was not born Jewish, but his father married her in spite of the fact that he knew what she was, and she raised him as an Orthodox Jew. He considered himself non-Jewish. He has to get a conversion. And so it shows more about, I think, his character. I was wondering, first thing, why they didn't explain the story of his mother is like an extra story that is not totally connected to the main topic. And why would a woman, they didn't explain, why would a woman that was not Jewish wanted to become, she almost died being Jewish. And he was so technical about it that he's not Jewish, in spite of the fact that he knows that she almost died being Jewish. And so, but they didn't explain why did she take somebody else's identity? She didn't have to. Her husband knew who she was.
Yeah, but when they came to Israel, they needed to take some kind of identity, otherwise she wouldn't be recognized. And this is a reality that I saw time and again with survivors, that at the time after the Holocaust, there was much more of a blend. The important things for people were very different than nowadays. Even when I was a child, most of my family was ultra-Orthodox, but yet a lot of things that now are hyper important for them weren't as important back then. And I know that back in the days, even before that, before I was born, these lines between Orthodox, non-Orthodox, what's important, what's less important, especially after the Holocaust, people just knew they were alive, and they were completely, I don't think they had the same definitions of selves as we have today. And I think my backstory, so to speak, of her life was that once they came to Israel and he associated to a more religious kind of area or neighborhood, suddenly with the education of kids, they became questions start to raise and so on. And she adopted this identity of his previous wife, which you see. She's taking the name of a woman that was married to him before the war, but wasn't his mother. So that's the backstory of this
By the way, because it was not necessary. We came to Israel in 1950. The rabbinate asked you, what are you? You say Israel. I mean, you're not a Kohen, yes. And Israel, they ask you the name of the mother and the father, and that's it. They didn't do investigations.
Yeah, but I can give you.
You didn't have to create a whole persona and lies.
I'll tell you just one example. My grandmother and my father, they escaped through Europe in a false identity. And then after the war, they went to Budapest. They survived there. And after the war ended, they went into, how is it called? Machane Purim. There were their camps.
Displaced.
Okay, the misplaced, exactly. And there, in order to get some benefits, you needed to show that you were Jewish. Because with their Gentile, so to speak, documents, they couldn't get in. So then I traced it and I saw how in certain places she used one identity and in other places she used another identity. So there are many places that you didn't need your Jewish identity in order to pass through. And this is the story that I had in my mind.
There's a question from Nina. What was the historical basis of the film? Was there a massacre in Dunsdorf?
Okay, that's a very big question. So, Lensdorf doesn't exist, but there is Rechnitz does, and if you Google it, this is the story I based the massacre story. The thing was that I did some changes in the story, and since I want to have a certain amount of freedom to change the original story, I called it in a completely different name. But here there is a very interesting story, and I'll start by saying that my main goal wasn't the historical story. I came to writing this script because I wanted the personal journey of identity, as I said. But I felt that this kind of thing of identity is so abstract that I wanted something very tangible that would be his historical research, and those stories would echo each other. And I was looking for an actual story that could echo it, some kind of a mystery that hasn't been solved yet. So I went through Yad Vashem and started investigating, looking for stories that happened in the Shoah that this researcher could work on. And I reached an Austrian historian called Walter Manuchek, and he told me this story of Rechnitz that he discovered. I can speak a lot about it if you have questions about it, but most of the facts are very accurate in the story. There was a massacre that took place like a few weeks before the ending of the war. And it's a horrific story because it took place in a party they did in that village of Rechnitz, which is on the border with Hungary, between Austria and Hungary. And while they were in this party, which was by the countess that owned the properties in this village, her best friend was this guy Podetsin, which was the head of the Gestapo. And as they were in the party, they got information that a train full of ill Jews are coming through the train station of this town. So they stopped the train, they sent trucks, and they brought them to the fields of this house, this mansion. And there, while they were in the party, they distributed arms and basically massacred them. This was towards the end of the war, and since then, the grave was never found. There's a long story about it. I won't go into all the details, but it was never researched thoroughly, just by private people. I'll fast forward 2 years after the film came out. I was invited to the president's house, Reuven Rivlin, here in Israel. I brought with me the only survivor of this massacre, Gavri Livne, who lives in Israel. And it was a diplomatic dinner with the Austrian president. And we were sitting at this dinner, and our president, Rivlin, stood up, spoke about this massacre, and said that Austria needs to do something about it. And the president of Austria stood up and said that he's committed to create a formal federal investigation. He went off of this stage and shook the hand of this Gavri Livne and apologized in the name of the Austrian people. And then the Austrian chancellor also watched the film, and they started a real investigation. They didn't find yet the grave, but I'm just saying that I never imagined that my small film will create something in reality. I was just looking for a story for my script, but it created some kind of a voice, an echo, and it created something in reality. They started after 75 years. It was the first time Austria was committed to find the victims of this massacre.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I had a different reaction to it because I'm a scientist. So when the film started out, I interpreted it as a battle for the truth. And given the political situation in our country, it's even more critical. So that, it surprised me, but then it seemed to shift to an identity issue. Who am I? And I found that very interesting because both things are incredibly important. And I had the feeling at the end of the film, it was kind of a to be continued issue. What happens to this man? How do we define who we are in the world? And I'm just letting you know, I mean, both of those are incredibly important. Neither should be downregulated, and just letting you know what my reaction to it was.
Sure. I think that for him, truth was his identity. I mean, this is what he was left with, which is seek of truth was his identity. That's why he couldn't even face the mirror, and he needed to cut. He couldn't stand himself in this reality, like he felt that he's fake. But it is open in the way that the call for identity is very personal, and I feel like that this is something I won't touch in this film. It's for some other project.
I have a question. When he shaved his beard, does it mean that is in his?
I can't hear you.
When he shaved his beard,
Yeah.
did it mean that he was becoming less religious? What does it mean?
What do you think?
I don't know. This is my question to you. It can mean that he did, or it may mean that he reconciled that maybe this rigid search for the truth in terms of whether his mother, was Jewish or not, well, she almost died like a Jew, maybe is not as important. People pointed it to him that he became a little bit more liberal with interpretation. I don't know. I'm asking you.
I can share. I myself came from the religious world, and to a certain degree, I'm still part of it. I wouldn't say I'm so religious by definition, but I do share a great amount of it. And I found myself, when I went very serious into my religion and to my belief. And at some certain point, when I went so deep through the tools of religion, I found myself outside. Meaning there is a certain contradiction that when you go all the way with a certain truth, you could sometimes can find yourself out of the system that gave you this tool of truth. And I think that he can't face, he's in a tragedy really, because on one side he's connected through his kishkes to who he is. But yet, because he takes upon himself this very rigid truth, he cuts his beard because he doesn't want to, as if, be fake. So I think this is the conflict he's facing. Now, I have a question to the moderator. Would you like me to continue answer questions or to go forward or tell something?
That's a great question because there are wonderful questions. How about you keep talking? Let's go on with the lecture, and we'll go back to the questions a bit further because I know I have plenty. But let's keep going, and we'll get back to the questions.
Okay, so just a second. I'll speak a bit about this historical event. So basically, what actually happened in this story, and something that I really wanted to share, was about denial. Like, I felt also as a person, but I think this protagonist faces this certain different kinds of silence. There's on one hand the silence of his mother that is telling her story. And then there is the silence of the denial in Austria of the historical story. And he's caught in this void in between. And I don't know if you noticed, but there were testimonials that were German. Now, these were actual people from the village of Rechnitz that actually denied where the grave was. There was a documentary done in the beginning of the 90s. When they started, there was a private Jewish Hungarian Jew that wanted to find those graves all along the border with Austria, because a lot of the history is that a lot of Hungarian Jews were sent to dig a very big, it was like, in order to prevent an invasion of the Russians with their tanks, they created this very large ditch, and the Jews were supposed to dig it. And they worked all along the border with really nothing. Sometimes they didn't have food, shoes, tools. It was a horrible situation where there was no supervision. It wasn't like the stories that we know from the camps. And there, in those areas, a lot of Jews died with no graves. Nobody knew about it because it wasn't this organized massacre that took place in Germany or in Poland. So he came, this guy from Hungary, after the war, and started in the 80s, and started digging those graves, finding them and bringing them to Kever Israel, to a Jewish cemetery. And then he came to this village, and he was expecting to find, because he heard about the massacre. So the villagers would send him to places as if to dig the graves, but he never found them. At a certain stage, he understood that they're really lying. And then came a documentary crew and decided to do a film about it. And these people that you see in my film, a few of them are the actual villagers that they're telling us, look, it's you could hear them. They say, wow, it's a terrible thing. We heard it, but we don't know where it was, etc., etc. And I want to show, and by the way, and this director told me that after shooting, and later on he understood that they did know, but they just didn't want to share that. They didn't want this to be known in Austria that they were responsible for a massacre. And I wanted to show how denial looks like. And I called it some kind of a polite denial, where we imagine Holocaust denial as, like demons, like people who said there was never a Holocaust. No, but it's so much more subtle. It's people who say, yes, it was horrible, but we don't really know where it was. Whenever they need to tell something about themselves, suddenly they forget. And that's a very common phenomenon. I can tell you that my film was when it was presented in Warsaw, in the Warsaw Film Festival. I was there for a few days, so I had a driver. And the driver told me, yes. Also, my grandfather told me of our Jews. And I said, what do you mean, our Jews? He says, yes, the Jews were our national asset. We had the guys from Lublin, etc., and all those scholars, the scholars of Lublin, and scholars all over, and they were like a national asset for us. I said, yes, so what happened during the war? So he said, and then my grandfather said, they suddenly disappeared. So I asked, and where did they go? So he said, my grandfather said that he doesn't know. He didn't know, they just disappeared. So, and this is, I'm talking like 5 years ago, not long ago. So I wanted to show also in this film how denial looks like. And I showed it in the film by really taking those actual people and putting them in the film. Okay, so
can I ask
yeah.
a question?
Yes, sure.
So two things. One of them, the building where the Holocaust research is going on, is that part of Yad Vashem, or is that another? I mean, it's not. I've been to Yad Vashem. I haven't seen that, so I don't know if it's there. The photography inside, the filming inside was spectacular. So if you could talk about that. And then the second thing is, I've been thinking a lot lately about this issue of memory, how people remember things. And the reason that I'm thinking about it a lot is because I'm a second gen. And the stories that I grew up hearing from during the Holocaust of my one of my parents shifted over time. And in the latter years, say the last 10 years, the stories are coming out quite different from the ones that I remember growing up with. And it wasn't, so my mother had, she didn't have an issue in general of problems with memory. She had perfect memory till the day she passed away. But can we trust, sort of, memory of people over time? And I'm really struggling with that.
So those are two very important, two different questions. One is more about the filmography. So I'll answer that first. So when you make a film, sometimes your liabilities become your biggest asset. So I was approaching Yad Vashem to do this film there because I wanted to use part of their facilities that I thought could assist us. But yet they did not allow it. Meaning we sat with their spokesman and they didn't even read the script. They said, we don't allow any shooting of any fiction film. If it would have been a documentary, we would consider it. But since it's a fiction, we don't do those kinds of things. So I said, but why? It's not like I'm doing a film about, I don't know, a football game that's the ball falls into Yad Vashem. I'm doing a film about your research. They couldn't hear that. So then I was forced to look for a different place. And luckily enough, I really like scouting for my own, finding my locations for my own films. and I live in Talbiya, Rehavia. And as I was doing my walks, I found out that Van Leer Institution, that's very close to the president's house, are building a new building, which is called the Polonsky Institute, which is this amazing building, and they were just opening it. And I was able to convince them to allow me to shoot it there because I found it very appealing. I really liked it. I wanted this transparent glass. I wanted this cement. I want this modern thing because I felt that the immediate thing when you say, oh, he's an historian, you would think, oh, something old and dumpy and like old school. And I said, let's give it a twist. Let's do the opposite. And that's how I ended up there. And they were generous enough to allow me to shoot there. So this is about Van Leer Institution. You could look it up.
I'm quickly sharing a screenshot that I just had to take.
Yes, yes,
which
yes,
is
that one, exactly.
Probably
you
my
say-
favorite shot of the movie.
Could you say the name of the institute again, of the name of the place?
Van Leer.
Van Leer?
Yeah.
Oh.
And this is the Polonsky building.
Would you mind speaking a little bit about the, sorry.
And there was just a question about memory and truth and history. So I'll just answer that briefly. I actually access it in this film where he speaks to this survivor, which is portrayed by Leah Koenig, that forgets her own story. And this was an event I actually had. I was supposed to do we were supposed to collect a testimony of a woman who was at the day in Ra'anana in some kind of an old age home or something. And we were told that there will be a huge testimony because she did a bestseller, more than one, about her personal story, about history and so on. So we prepared ourselves, back then there was a lot of cassettes, video in order to record her. And as we were going into the interview, I was with a psychologist who asked questions. And quite fast, when the psychologist, the interviewer, is asking her questions, so she's asking her, maybe she could summarize things that she remembers from the book. Okay, so she starts telling her story. And then the psychologist wants this actual survivor to continue. And the survivor is asking her questions about her family. And as she's telling it, she says, oh, what a sad story. And then we understood that she completely lost her own memory and she's hiding it from us. And she just doesn't remember her own story. And this was so surreal for me that I couldn't forget that. And therefore I put it in my story where she's asked what happened and where, and then she asked what happened to my brother. And the protagonist is telling Yoel, is telling her, well, your brother was sent to Auschwitz, and then she's completely shocked by it. And this is a very big question about memory and truth. And it's part of the reality. I don't know. I don't have really an answer for this.
I think your answer strongly defines kind of the time that we're in after the war, after the Holocaust. The survivors themselves are not very young anymore, and I think that's kind of the time that we're there, and we want to remember, and we also want to move on while still remembering. And I think that shows that in a very interesting manner. The movie itself, there's a lot of searching there. Also, Yoel himself, that's his job, and he's also searching within himself. And I'd like you, if you can, speak about the genre that you chose, or maybe the genre that chose you for the movie. I'll just say that I had to bring this in. Yeah, there are a lot of characteristics of a detective movie.
Yeah.
If you can speak a little bit about that.
Well, the truth is that I believe that using a genre helps you. It gives you like the the metaphors for what you're looking for. So especially me, that I wanted something that's so abstract, because like this question of identity, how do you define it? How do you hold on to it? Like if I'm telling you your mother was non-Jewish, so what really happened? Nothing, but yet everything. And for some people, it would be nothing. For others, it's everything. And those questions are so abstract. How do you touch them? How do you access them? And I wanted, like, the investigation gives you a really good metaphor. The search, the uncovering the earth, the looking in the files is really the metaphor of the inner search. And that's why I chose this genre, especially that I wanted to say something. I must say, I didn't want to impose on the audience a certain heaviness of a Holocaust story. I wanted them to be curious for the story itself without imposing anything. And I felt by doing something that is a real mystery could allow you very gently entering a more substantial question, but without forcing you. You could also enjoy the film, so to speak, even without understanding all the depth that it touches. I mean, for me at least. And you could just, so to speak, enjoy the film, even through your curiosity of understanding what really happened in the end, what was the mystery, how did they solve it. And I used a lot of, like the Siddur, that on one page you have the prayers, on the other the lists of, the death sentence. For me, it was a huge metaphor, like it reminded me of Yom Kippur as a religious kid, davening in shul and, thinking and reading the words that now we're sentenced to death or not. So like you read this book and on one side is really you're sentenced, on the other. So all these metaphors allowed me to tell my story, and I think in a clearer way, or in a more something you could feel.
I think, hi,
Go ahead.
yeah, one of the things that struck me and was two things. One, when the character says, I know it's today and they still hate us.
Yeah.
It was, I thought, a very telling moment, especially where we are in world history today. And the second is part of our liturgy that says kindness is more important than truth. And I thought that one of the understandings that might be contributed in the film to us as an audience, wrestling with identity and horror and hiding, is that our Jewish heritage provides perhaps something more important than truth, maybe more important than whether your mother was Jewish or not. And I say that very carefully, that we're defined by our values and our kindness and our hope for the future. And that is more important, whatever the truth is. That is the salvation, like Pandora's box. Everything's released into the world, and finally the last is hope. And so in some ways, I think you made a brilliant contribution at many levels, still thinking about it, and will continue to think about the various levels of the man shaving off his beard, where my wife and I gasped that he would do this after all these years, that he would actually strip himself of the identity, but yet he can't. He has to be Jewish to his mother, who wasn't Jewish, and give her a Jewish burial, a kindness. I thought it was a brilliant film. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll at this point, I think I'll share with you some, unless someone wants to ask me something.
I
Hi,
did.
this is Judy from Indiana. I have a question about his son and the symbolism of his son not studying enough and dropping his book, his studies. How did you decide, and why was that in there?
So first of all, I was a stubborn kid that learned by myself for my bar mitzvah. But I wanted this conflict where, on their shoulders, this Yoel, the researcher, so wants to be Jewish, it's so part of him. And suddenly his son has the opportunity. And he feels this responsibility that at least he will be something that he cannot be. And this gap between generations that really comes from a warm heart, but that can't communicate it, is something that I wanted to share. And I'm sure he loves his son, but this passion, like, is overwhelming. The situation that he's in is like so impossible, and I wanted to show that.
I have a question.
Okay, sure.
Okay. I was really pondering why his mother would keep that secret. I understand why she kept the secret, but why she didn't think about conversion once she got to Israel. Was it the times, early, was it that Israel was a young country? Would they look at her differently? But she led a Jewish life since she was 3 years old. And she chose to be a religious woman. Why wouldn't she convert? And then it wouldn't be such an issue with her children. Why would she keep that as a secret until her death, to then let her children know, who are observant Jews, you're not really Jewish halachically?
You can see it in the way his sister reacts.
Yes.
Once you're a convert, you have a completely different yichus, if you understand what I'm saying.
Yes.
And at the first stage, it didn't feel so important, because I'm sure that for herself, she feels she's Jewish. She seems to me like a personality that is very built. She's not a fake person. But yet, for the surroundings, for the family, suddenly you need to do things that you don't want to harm their lives. And if she would say it, then they would be in a completely social situation in their surroundings. And I portrayed it through the daughter and her reaction to the story.
Right. Thank you.
So, look, I basically in this film didn't try to show, even though we're talking about the truth is very important in this film. You could see that every person there has a certain truth. Nobody is really evil. It's not that, and I emphasize it. It was very important for me not to make one of those characters as if this is the right and this is wrong. But everyone had his own agenda. And Yoel's agenda could be very genuine, but yet could be also very cruel in certain ways. Cruel to himself, maybe cruel to his family. And his sister could be a bit faking it, but yet she's truthful to her. She needs to take care of her grandchildren. So, and it was important for me not to make an easy job, to make someone the bad guy and the others, and to leave us with this question. Because I think it's a real question that we're facing nowadays, these questions of identity. So I'll just share another story with you. So this film was the first co-production with Austria, between Israel and Austria. And so I obviously needed to travel there in order to have the actors. We needed to cast the actors in Austria. So I had their casting agent, and I would go back and forth. So I was looking for this, the lady that was running the judge or whatever that ran the debate that we saw there in those screens. So I was looking for the actress to do this role, and this lady was offered, but yet my casting agent said, "Look, she's a quite famous figure in Austria. She's a great actress, and it's a very small part, so I feel a bit offended. I mean, I feel that she would be offended if I offer her this part because it's too small." So I told her, you know what, are you convinced that she's a good person for this role? She said, yes, 100%. So I said, look, so let's do this. You'll tell her that it's an Israeli director, and Israelis don't have such good manners. And therefore, he was rude and really imposed on you to ask her. And worst case, you'll blame me and she won't be offended. So she accepted that. And when I came back to Israel, I got a message for her that this actress wants to do the part. She was very surprised. Next time I arrived to Austria, and we do auditions for this part, and we have a few ladies, actresses coming, and then she came in, and she played the part amazingly. And I did something that I never do, which is in the audition itself, I told her, this is your part. You'll do the part. So she said, thank you. She was about to leave the room, and then she asks me, would you like me to tell you why I took this part? So I said, yes, of course. So she said, at the day, she said, I'm 55 years old, and just 3 years ago, I discovered I'm Jewish. So I asked, okay, what's the story? So she said that she was raised by her mother, only by her mother. The dad wasn't in the picture. And she knew all along that during the war, they had a difficult time, but a lot of people have a difficult time, regardless of being Jewish. But then one day, after her mother passed away, a few years later, her uncle passed away, and his wife called her, saying that she found something, a document in their closet as she was cleaning up. And she called her over to look what it is. So basically, they found this huge piece of paper. It looked like Hebrew, but they didn't know for sure. So they took it to the Jewish community. Turns out it's the ketubah of their grandmother, her mother's mother. And they're checking it in the community, and the community says, well, of course we know that she was in this community, and even her daughter, which is the mother of the actress, is registered. So basically, in a blink of a second, she knows she's a Jew. And when she got this script, she said, wow, it's like a miracle that this landed here. And she decided to do the part. Little did I know. So she's telling me that only a few friends of hers know that she's Jewish. She didn't tell it, definitely not publicly. And she's quite famous there. And then we had our first screening in Venice. And it's like 3,500 people. It's a really big cinema. And after the screening, they're asking us to, for a Q&A. So we stand there and they ask us, me and the actors and the DOP, all the producer, what's your connection to this story, your personal connection? So she stands up and tells her story. And she says, this is the first time ever that I'm saying publicly that I'm Jewish. And everyone went silent, and then everyone clapped, and it was a very, very moving moment. So again, you make a movie, you never know. You never know who will be part of it. There are miracles here that, people just land into this script and into this film, and it means something.
I think that's an amazing story, first of all, and I think it just goes to show with this and how and your story with the president and the Austrian president, how the influence and the importance of film within our society, within the world, and it's a very, very strong impact and a beautiful story, and I think it kind of ends at the point where we're left searching for ourselves as Yoel is, in a way, if I'm allowed to say so. This was intriguing, a very intriguing meeting. I want to thank you personally, Amichai, for being a part of, for coming here and lecturing to us on Zoom, and sharing your movie and your story and your personal story of the movie here. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
Of course, you're invited to all our future meetings. We do them every few months. I'd like everybody to stay tuned for the information about our next meetings. We have some very strong ideas coming up. And for those who haven't seen the film yet, the film testament will be up for the next week or so. Again, thank you, Amichai. Thank you, Avital.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for being part of this.
Yeah.
Thank you, Amichai. It was
Thank you.
fascinating.
Everybody is left with like a million questions, but we'll need to look you up for those, I think.
Okay. So Darava, good night.
Thank you for making
Hi,
this
thank you
beautiful
very
film.
Bye so fast.
No, it went very fast.
Yeah.
It went-